I'm Pam Allison. Just to give you kind of a little bit about me, I used to work for an anti-piracy company doing business intelligence. So that was looking at, how companies can actually do things differently in order to combat piracy, not just some of the anti-piracy things that we'll talk about today. So how many of you have pirated content? Oh, I don't believe that. You're not on camera. It's okay. All right. Well, I don't believe it. I was telling Vaughn a little bit ago that I actually fear that my grandmother is pirating, but not on purpose, of course. We hope. So we're going to talk a little bit today just about piracy, what the types of piracy are, where the content comes from, and kind of some general trends. So first, what is piracy? So obviously it's the illegal distribution of content through either the internet or through hard goods or DVDs. So this could be anything. It's really anything that can be done digitally. So movies, TV shows, music, games, electronic books. Today we're going to really concentrate on internet piracy of American-produced content, in particular television and movies. So why do people pirate? I know none of you pirate, so you just don't even know. But kind of probably the biggest reason is that the content isn't available in their market. So it could just be television shows that aren't on the air yet. It could be movies that aren't yet in the market where they are, in the country where they're living. Maybe they just don't want to wait for the content to be in the window where they can afford it. So they can afford, for example, to go to the movies or don't have the time, so instead they go online and pirate it. Some just don't believe in paying for content. Obviously, those are the little more sinister ones. And there are people, and this is where we hope people are good-hearted, is that they are actually looking for legal content, but they just happen upon illegal content. Now, we hope, of course, that they know it's illegal, but there are instances where it's not. A friend of mine told me about his son who actually went online and found some content, and of course he felt terrible telling his 10-year-old son it was actually illegal, so it does happen. We'll hope that people are actually good. So who are the consumers of pirated content? Well, it really could be anyone, but we do know that it skews male and young, so just kind of the general thing. I know that's not a shocker, but something I thought I would just point out. There are two methods, main methods on the internet where people, how people pirate content. So the first is peer-to-peer, and the second is through websites, and where they use cyber lockers and streaming sites. And I'll go into detail on those. So peer-to-peer piracy is, have you all heard of BitTorrent? So BitTorrent is kind of the biggest protocol known for peer-to-peer. And it's a very efficient method to distribute large files, especially if you have a slow internet connection. And I'll explain how BitTorrent works in a moment. So as I said, BitTorrent is the most popular protocol, but there's others as well, eDonkey, Ares, Gnutella. And some of those are just more popular in other countries. For example, eDonkey, for some reason, is more popular in Latin American countries. The downside of peer-to-peer, because there should be some, is that companies can track you. So if you download content using peer-to-peer, companies like the one I used to work for can connect to you, and they know who you are. They know your IP address, and they can go to your ISP, and they can actually find out who you are and take methods to stop you. But there are ways around it. Not that this is a how-to guide, by the way, but consumers can use what's called an internet anonymizer service that kind of masks their IP address to prevent that. So there are ways, and I'm not saying to go do this. So how BitTorrent works. So just kind of in general. What you do is you go out there and you get what's called a BitTorrent client, which is just a piece of software. Kind of well-known ones include uTorrent. And you just download it to your computer, PC, Mac, it doesn't really matter. And then you go and you download what's called a torrent file. And this is a really small file that just has some information in it. It doesn't have the actual movie or TV show or piece of content. It's just a pointer. And what that file does is it points to trackers or servers. And on those servers, it tells you who has pieces of the content that you want. So each of these peers may not have the entire file that you want, but it has pieces of it, so you connect to them. And what's really powerful about this technology is that if one of the peers goes away, you can still download that file because you're connected to other peers. And the more peers that exist, the faster you can download. And you start connecting to them, and as you start downloading, people start connecting to you. So typically what happens is for very popular pieces of content, it's actually much faster to download using BitTorrent. So it's very efficient. Now, we're talking about it in an illegal sense, but it can also be used for legal means. So, many of these technologies obviously are used for good, but they're also used for illegal goods as well. So the second type of method people use is called website piracy, and there's two parts to this. So the first is how they find content, and then the second is actually getting the content. So first, consumers can go to something called a linking site, and this is typically a site that links to the content or the host site. So this could be a website, and I've just kind of shown a couple here. For example, Sidewheel. If you went to Sidewheel, which I'm sure you would never do, you could search for a piece of content, and it will tell you where you can go get it. And that would either be a direct download, or it could just be streaming if it's a television show or a movie. There's also very popular blogs or forums that also just list this content. Again, they're not hosting the content, they're just telling you where you can go get it. The second piece is search engines. So you can go to Google and you can search for content, and I won't give you the keywords, but it's not hard. But you can, search for a piece of content, and more than likely you will easily come up in Google, Bing, Yahoo with, illegal content. And this is why I was saying, sometimes people search for content and find it illegally instead of legally. Maybe they were really looking for illegal content. So, but again, we hope people are good. So hosting sites. So these are sites where the link sites link to or point to. And there's two parts to it. So one is a cyber locker, which allows a direct download of content. So this is something like RapidShare. How many of you have heard of RapidShare? So a handful of you. It's actually, I believe, the number 4 or 5 most visited site in the world. And it's kind of amazing that many people actually haven't heard of it, given that. But it is used both for illegal content and legal content as well. So content companies would have a hard time taking that site down because it is used for people like us. If we wanted to share, for example, this presentation, I could upload it to RapidShare, send you the link, and then you can download it. And it would be secure, and only you and I would know what that content is, which is in part why it can be used so well for pirated content, because RapidShare doesn't know what the content is. All they know is that a piece of content was uploaded. And then the second is streaming sites. These are sites where the content is hosted on there, and you can just play it on that site. Consumers are starting to migrate from peer-to-peer to website piracy. In the past, and still peer-to-peer is very large, so I don't mean to say that peer-to-peer isn't as important. But consumers are starting to migrate to what I'm calling website piracy. And the reasons are faster broadband speeds. As I said, peer-to-peer is a very efficient method for distributing content. But it really is important when you don't have a fast broadband connection. But when you do, you can just now download the content very quickly, and you don't have to worry about the efficiency. Additionally, website piracy is much more private. As I said, with peer-to-peer, a company like the one I used to work for can connect to you and know your IP address. But with a website piracy, the only company that knows who you are is the company where you're accessing that content. And more than likely, they won't give that up. So, if you're concerned about, evading anti-piracy companies, website piracy might be the way to go. So where does the content come from? It can come from a variety of sources. So, probably the most well-known kind of piracy that you know about is a camcorder in a theater, where somebody takes a camcorder in the theater. They typically maybe hide it in the arm of the seat. They connect to the audio, maybe in the handicap seat, which is often where there's better audio, and they just record it. Of course, the disadvantage of this is you have someone getting up in front of you and going to the bathroom. Might be shaky. So they're not typically really great copies, but it is a big source of piracy, especially for theatrical films that are still in the theaters. Higher quality content comes from DVDs. So this is, directly ripped, and this is typically done when it's, in the home video window. Television, a lot of content is recorded directly off of television. It's usually recorded in high definition, so it's good quality. A kind of lesser known piracy or less common piracy is the theatrical print. The most well-known piece of content that was ripped from a theatrical print was Wolverine, which was actually a pre-release copy. In other words, it wasn't even finished, but it was still widely pirated. And the content comes from around the world. It's not, typically the television content does originate in the United States, but typically the camcorded versions are, in Eastern Europe and China, just to give a generalization, but it really can vary based on the content. Pirates are actually kind of nice. I know that sounds odd, but they subtitle the movies in a variety of languages very quickly. So, they're quite kind. And there's a correlation, which I'll show you in a little bit, that as, a certain language is subtitled onto a movie, that's when that country has an increase in piracy. So Spanish and Italian versions are very, very popular. So with American content, and I'll talk about that also in a couple minutes. And then television content, like I said before, they record it in high definition, which is really nice, and they take the commercials out. I mean, that's better than your DVR. That's better than if you went to Hulu. They're nice people with a lot of time on their hands. So what are people pirating? I know this isn't a shocker. It's action, it's science fiction, it's adventure, and it's some comedy. The pirates, just like our studio executives, know who's watching the content. They know who's pirating the content. It's young men. So if they're consuming the pirated content, the pirates are going to focus on their demographic. Comedy, I'll just talk about briefly for a second. Comedy is interesting because the comedy tends to be very American. So it's usually less popular online, but there are certain instances where comedy is big. Because we do know, especially in the U.S., comedy often focuses on, 18 to 35-year-old males, so it can be very popular in the U.S., but when you start changing the language, it may not be so funny in another language. So, what are the top pirated movies in 2009? So I can't tell you the top movies based on the company I used to work for, but I can tell you what Torrent Freak says. So Torrent Freak is a blog about piracy. and they released this list last year. I will tell you, they use a different methodology than many anti-piracy companies. But I would say they're fairly close, though we have some differences. But one thing this does tell you is that typically the top pirated movies are also the top grossing movies. There's a fairly direct correlation. And part of that is simply marketing dollars. Just like marketing dollars drive theatrical release, it's also going to drive pirated copies because that's what people know about. So Star Trek being the top downloaded movie and also one of the top grossing movies of last year, really not surprising. Rock and Rolla, you know, I was actually surprised to see this so high on their list. But it, you know, relatively it did okay at the box office. But again, you can see just looking through this list, it is typically science fiction, you know, and some action movies, which really goes with our, you know, young male demographic. Television shows is a little different. Again, it's still science fiction type content. So Heroes, which is popular here in the US, but certainly not the most popular television show, is quite popular online. And it actually has been for a couple years. Lost, Prison Break, all of these have been very popular, you know, in terms of pirated content. What's interesting here is you start to see a show like Dexter, which is only on Showtime. So, you know, for companies like, for shows like Dexter, which are only on a premium channel, they might look at this and start to see opportunity in other places in the world. So, but again, you know, there isn't a correlation here between Nielsen ratings and pirated content. Television is much more about the genre. So where are people consuming the pirated content? Well, they're everywhere. They're all over the world. They're not really focused on any one country or any particular part of the world. To some extent, it's everywhere. But there is the most popular places, or the places that consume the most. So for movies, and it is different for movies and television. So for movies, it's Italy. And you might ask yourself, well, why Italy? That seems very odd. They're a small country. A couple reasons. So one is laws around piracy and how much they're enforced in terms of piracy. The second is just culture, you know, whether it's okay or not okay to pirate in that culture. And the third is pirated content is often subtitled in Italian very quickly, and so that really drives the piracy there, and you can see the direct correlation. The U.S. obviously, or maybe not obviously, but since we're talking about American-produced content, the U.S. typically will pirate a lot, and then Spain, France, and in the U.K. So it's really European-based and in English. For television, it's a bit different because pirates aren't typically subtitling television because it's episodic and it's frankly too much work. They're nice, but they're not that nice. So it's the U.S., it's the U.K., it's Canada. So not surprising, those are the ones most interested in American content, so those are the ones who are consuming it. Evolution. So when a piece of pirated content is put out there, typically there are multiple versions put out there, and it evolves over time. So first, a really bad quality version might be put up, then a higher quality version will be posted. And you'll see that evolution, that people will start pirating the second, third, fourth, fifth versions of the content as it improves. Also, as I spoke about before, subtitled content. If a piece of content is subtitled with the language in a particular country, you'll see piracy start to increase. Better audio, so that makes a difference. So one thing you might ask is, how do people know? Well, people will post contents around each of the content and say, okay, this one has better audio, and you'll start to see people migrate towards that version. Each version of this content is called a hash. And the reason, and I wanted to kind of just make a definition of what a hash is. So a hash is uniquely identified by what's called a binary code, which is this really long it's kind of like DNA, it's like an address. And every version, whether it's a higher quality, whether it's subtitled, whether it's different audio, all has a uniquely identified hash. So anti-piracy companies can actually go and tell you the difference and tell you which version of a particular movie is being pirated. So I wanted to show you a piece of content and how the hashes evolved. So this is a piece of content. It's a movie where you can see these are various kinds of hashes that were put out there. And so, on day 1, there was a piece of content out there, but it wasn't that popular. And then around day 10 or so, or maybe day 8, a new version was put out. And it was probably a higher quality version, so people started to download it. And then a few other versions came out there, and those were just either higher quality or maybe a subtitled version. But then you can see on around day 37 or so, there was a huge spike. And there was something very particular about that hash, which is why it was so popular. And you might be able to tell from here, which is you can see on these later hashes, or on the later part of this chart, the white one is China. So you can see by looking at the prior chart that was probably a Chinese version of the movie. So that had a direct impact on how popular this piece of content is in China. And there's a fairly direct correlation between the subtitled versions and the versions that are and how popular they are in certain countries. So ultimately, what can we do about piracy? Well, there's some things you can do. So the first is you can monitor it. So as I said with peer-to-peer, an anti-piracy company can connect to you and actually tell what your IP address is. Well, obviously, if they know your IP address, they know where you live. And they can actually get down to the city. So they could tell you, X thousands of people downloaded a piece of content in Rome or in Los Angeles or wherever. So you can learn a lot about a piece of content and how popular it is. And content companies might use that information to change their business models, change their distribution models, because they know a certain type of content is really popular in a certain part of the world. So it can be used to do a lot of good things. And, change strategies and change business models. It might be offering something in an earlier window. Maybe it's pushing something out on DVD much sooner than they thought they were going to. The second thing that companies do today is send takedown notices, which are just kind of blatant. You have to take the notice down. And there's something called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, which forces companies to take down the content within a certain period of time. And most of the companies that I talked about today, RapidShare, et cetera, actually do it very quickly. So that can be effective, but it's also like whack-a-mole, that game at the carnival. Because you take one down, some of the content's going to pop up somewhere else. But you still have to do it, right? Like, you can't not do it. The third thing is to work with ISPs in order to shut down the pirates. That's what you've seen with the Pirate Bay, which is the most well-known pirated website. The ISPs can be helpful, but it's really hard for the ISPs because at the end of the day, those are their customers. Those are the people paying their bills. So it's a struggle for them, but it's something that many of the content companies are working on. And then it's also kind of on a larger level, working with governments in order to shut down illegal websites. So again, that's something like the Pirate Bay or even smaller sites that you may not have